Welcome everyone, and welcome to our now regular appointment with IBA Stage. For those of you less familiar with the series, IBA Stage is a series of online events in which invited biennials have a chance to deliver a presentation of their most recent project. The series was developed very much as a response to the impossibility of traveling during the height of the COVID pandemic, but we kept it as part of our public program as we thought it would continue to be a great tool to create a lasting archive of biennials across the world for our members and those interested, and a way of discussing with the biennial makers about their vision, their projects, and the results of these. Before welcoming our guests today, I wanted to quickly run through a few house rules, which those of us that are now familiar with Zoom presentations and so on, it should be a repetition, but it never hurts. First of all, I want to remind everyone that the event is being recorded and also streamed through our social media outlets. And I also take a moment to welcome those of you that are following us from YouTube and from our Instagram accounts. So, regarding the house rules, they're very simple. If you wish to speak, please use the raise your hand function or write a question in the chat. During the presentation, please do keep your mic and camera off. But of course, during the Q&A session, you're more than welcome to open them and interact with us. If you have any other questions that are not related to this specific event, you can, of course, feel free to send us an email at info@biennialassociation.org. And I think that's us with the house rules. So I'm really happy to present to you today
So hello, everybody, whoever's following. My name, as Christian said, is Maria-Thalia Carras. I'm a curator based in Athens. I've been working for many years on ecological issues. So when I was invited by the Thessaloniki Biennial, which had for 2023 to curate its exhibition, its central exhibition for Thessaloniki, for a broader program called Cultura, I immediately, having in 2018 already co-curated an exhibition called Geometries, which already looked at the relationship between humankind and how it measured itself vis-a-vis the earth. I was interested, or my vision, if you like, for the Thessaloniki Biennial was to think about our relationship to a form of failure to actually react or shift in time, and how through those failures and through those micro failures, we could start thinking of different ways of coexisting, maybe on a better coexisting together through different communities, working, collaborating, and the title, Being as Communion, is a slightly provocative title because it's from a seminal text by a prominent Greek Orthodox theologian called Professor John Zizioulas. And it comes from his research into looking into proto-Christian communities where radical thinking didn't come about from people who lived had a monastic life. He had discovered that basically progressive thinking was born from people who lived in communities together. And so therefore, being as communion, which in Greek is translated zoios kinonia, in other words, life as community, if you like, became the premise for this exhibition of looking to see how we can live together as long as we assume that we have also failed in so many ways to react or change or shift or move on from the paradigm that we're living in. So the idea of being as communion was a question of thinking on what terms can we learn to coexist, and whether that's possible, while also understanding the multiple failures. Of course, the title is slightly provocative as well, because Thessaloniki, which I don't know if any of you have visited, is a city which historically is very much aligned to Mount Athos and has a very conservative religious slant. So to bring the language and the philosophy and the thinking of a progressive Orthodox thinker within a contemporary art exhibition, but also in a city steeped in conservatism, is quite a nuanced, I think, I felt, entry into rethinking Thessaloniki's history. I'll just read one of the key quotes that for me influenced my thinking, and it's by Julieta Singh from The Breaks. I don't know if you've read it, but it says, if we hope to survive, not as a subjugate communion, but also as a life form among other life forms, this survival requires an unequivocal turn towards unacknowledged, discarded, and subaltern histories of collective resistance. So starting from the premise of how we can think about collective resistances to the current paradigm, I started also to look into Thessaloniki itself. So whilst talking about a future, how can one talk about a future in a city with a 3,000-year-old past, which spans from antiquity to Roman times to Byzantium to the Ottoman period, with all those crescendos and collapses of different civilizations and how they merge and shift and come together. Within that context, as in the contemporary or more recent history of Thessaloniki, for those of you that don't know, there's also been a failure of many communities to live together. So how does one talk about living together in a city that has so specifically failed? And I'll just reference 2 or 3 elements of that, which I think are very relevant, both to the thinking of the exhibition as how it unfolded, and also to the city itself. One is that during the Second World War, 1 week before the end of the occupation, 48,000 Jews were sent to Auschwitz. So the whole community, Jewish community of Thessaloniki, was essentially wiped out. And worse than that, when they returned, I mean, no worse than that, but when they returned, those who did return, the the Greek city-state of Thessaloniki had basically, in its form of sort of thinking about a ethnically sort of Greek modern state, had already destroyed the cemetery, and the university was later, the Greek university was later built on the site of the Jewish cemetery. There has been no form of remembrance, and until this day, for example, there's a big debate about the square where the Jewish male community were sent to do some horrible tasks. So there were all this history has yet to be both acknowledged, not acknowledged, but sort of worked on and considered, and et cetera, et cetera. So also added to that, there's the Ottoman history of the city where, for example, there's a history of there's an archaeological museum and a Byzantine museum, but there isn't a museum which relates to the Ottoman history of the city. So you see that within this nationalist modernist narrative, there are certain gaping holes. So when talking about the future and thinking about how we can live together in the future, it became an extra challenge to think about how can we talk about a future and a coexistence in a city that clearly throughout its history has been unable to honor the coexistence of its different micro-communities. Briefly speaking, the exhibition started on March the 5th, ended May 21st. There were 28 artists, 11 commissions. And within this plurality of the vision, there were 10 historical sites in Thessaloniki that were activated. That was a form also of a visual representation, if you like, of all the different moments. So from the Ottoman period to the modernist, there were all sorts of different moments in the history of Thessaloniki, which through the exhibition we tried to touch upon. Also tried, importantly for me, to keep the exhibition to the scale of the city. So Thessaloniki is the second biggest city in Greece with a population of 1 million. Often there is a tendency, I feel, to make exhibitions which are superlative and which are a form of visual consumption. So I made a very considered choice that within the budget and also within the framework and scale of the city, the way to truly understand and be able to walk through the city and have a reflection on these different moments, it would be better to have a smaller scale exhibition. So I considered the 28 artists with 11 commissions was a correct approach. Here, I'm just going to start walking you through some of the works from now on, and through the works, talking about the different issues that we touched upon. So this is a very interesting project for me. It's by the collective Coyote, who are Paris-based, but are different cultural practitioners, from artists to sound engineers to publishers, who think about language, and created a project which was a form of sort of hijacking of all the cultural institutions which hosted the exhibition. So this project is called "Absence is the Highest Form of Presence," which is a quote from James Joyce. And essentially, through our research into the missing communities of Thessaloniki, which I mentioned before, the Jewish communities and the Ottoman past, they decided to create a campaign, a sort of visual advertising campaign, which would appear in all the exhibition spaces, which would be quotes from prominent thinkers like Gertrude Steid, Monica Wittig, James Joyce, and which would be translated into 3 languages: Greek, Ladino, which is the language that the Jewish community in Thessaloniki used to speak, and of which there are very, very few people who still understand and speak, and in Ottoman Turkish. This meant that in a way we were making visible the micro communities, although at the time they weren't micro, the various communities that used to coexist on a visual and on a linguistic level. It was a kind of form of a linguistic ploy where they thought of the past, but actually it signified also how on these banners, these 2 And here's a quote by Gertrude Stein, which I think you can probably guess which one it is. And here's on the Byzantine Museum, a quote by Monica Wittig, which is in both in Greek and in Ottoman Turkish, which really enthused Coyot the idea that on the Byzantine Museum, there would be this Ottoman Turkish language being used. So that's the one sort of looking towards the past of Thessaloniki. And here is a quote that was along the Momus Museum, which again is about thinking about the future, but it's also in Ladino, it's also about the past, it relates all sorts of elements and threads of the exhibition, as you can see. A second work, which also relates to the history of Thessaloniki, and this is the beautiful site, which is the Yeni Zami, which is a former mosque, which has a very interesting history, because it's a mosque for a community called the Donme. The Donme were a community who followed a messiah in the, I think, 16th century called Sabbatai Zevi, who persuaded them to be his follower, and they were so afraid of him in Istanbul that they asked him to convert. Although they were all Jewish followers, they all asked him to convert to Islam, and all these followers, the Donme, which literally means inside out, converted to Islam. So this is a mosque in Thessaloniki, but it's a Donme mosque. So you find signs of Jewish stars positioned in all different parts of the building. So in relation to that, we placed a work by Alexandra Paperno called Abolished Constellations, which refers to the rule in 1922, where 88 constellations were confirmed and classified, but she refers to the 51 constellations that were abolished. So this is a work which each panel that you see on the work represents one constellation that no longer exists. So this idea of how we create systems which we then find arbitrary, which is similar to the sort of religious shifts from Judaism to being a Donme, et cetera, and all these man-made constructs, and our failure, therefore, in a way, to safeguard or keep a form of collectivity is also a precursor to thinking about how we could then possibly live together. Here's another work, which again references the various histories of the city. This is a work by Turkish artist Cevdet Erek, and it has two titles, only in Greek and in Turkish. The title in Greek is Tis Thessalonikis tis Ioavles, which I'm going to have to, I guess, translate into English, which means in Thessaloniki's two courtyards. And the way this work works is that there were two central courtyards, which are part of the nationalist paradigm and sort of narrative of the city, and they're next door, and they're part of this institutionalizing, historicization of the city. So there's next door the Archaeological Museum and the Byzantine Museum, and they both have two central courtyards. So within these courtyards, Cevdet Erek placed these two sculptural objects, which refer to the architecture. In the Byzantine Museum, to the architecture of this important Greek architect called Kyriakos Krokos, and the Archaeological Museum to the modernist architecture of that building. But in some ways, these two strange objects, which are like palimpsests of the history of Thessaloniki. In other words, their very materiality responds to different layers of history, from cement to the modern state, to marble, which references antiquity, to the bricks, which interestingly, the Byzantine Museum, it's exactly the same bricks that the Byzantine Museum is actually built from, and which we later discovered that the producer who imports them, his family had fled from Turkey and had brought their bricks with them in 1922. So in some ways, again, there's a movement, both of materials and history, and how sort of making clear-cut categorizations is so absolutely impossible. So these two objects in two courtyards imply that, one cannot fix history so clearly in two historical moments, and that there's something more fluid in between. And it's as if these two objects are sort of reaching out to speak to each other and to become sort of have a conversation between two periods and two places through their materiality. Similar conversations happened in other works, which linked again different traces of history of the city. This is Kostis Rousakis. He's a Greek artist who made 3 works which span the city. One in the concert hall, which is this building here, which is looking towards the sea. One at the Byzantine Museum, which is the museum we just saw beforehand. And one in the former prison, which was a Byzantine fortress that then became a prison right until 1990s. And this work had to do with actually, it's called Love Thy Neighbor. And it's related to this line and history that runs across sort of Thessaloniki, both horizontally and vertically. And the idea of the cross as the paradigm of an axis of all sculpture and the way that we relate to the world. And here's another viewpoint of the Megaro. And here's the work in the Byzantine Museum in the central courtyard, which is, as you can see, the cross is something that reappears with all the weight of its symbolism in a city like Thessaloniki. And here he's bearing it. And it's the idea that the 3 crosses that appear in each building in some way reflect the history of the story of the crucifixion of Christ. Another work that references the history of Thessaloniki and the failure of communities is this work by Paki Vlosopoulou, another Greek artist. This work references a beautiful book by the Iranian refugee, No Friend But the Mountain. I'm not sure if you've read it, but it's strongly recommended. And she looks into this work is situated in the prison that I mentioned before, which is on the very top of the hill of Thessaloniki. And she researched into prisons and forms of exclusion, because within the history of this prison, we discovered there were quite a few moments of collectivity where the prisoners came together and reacted or resurrected or celebrated. And so we started thinking into the history of prisons and how confinement, but also how it relates to the current refugee crisis and the way in Greece on various islands like Leros and Mytilene, there are these sort of camps which are very contained and where there is no essential way out. So this wall, which literally just leans onto the wall of the building, has this tiny slit, which in Paki Vlosopoulou's research, she realized in Chicago, there was a prison that was designed with the smallest slit window that could exist for someone to be able to see out, but not have to have bars. So this is what this refers to, but also the way the building, the wall leans onto the building is reflective of after again, relating back to the history of Thessaloniki, that this castle or prison, as the refugees arrived in Thessaloniki in the 1920s, everybody built houses which literally leaned onto it. So this idea both of containment, both of the impossibility of moving away from this enclosure, but also the human need to just literally lean and touch one on top of the other. So throughout these works, you can see that both, whilst trying to think about the future in Thessaloniki, in a city like that, the history of it and the weight, kept on drawing us backwards. So somehow it was impossible to talk about how to exist in the future without touching upon this fractured past and the difficulties of living together, essentially. Nevertheless, when thinking about, this is another view of Paki Vlasopoulou, when thinking about this inability and this difficulty and these challenges, one of the things that I decided to do curatorially is to look to two or three artists who would be sort of precursors or ways or shining beacons, if you like, where we would look to them as references for learning from them on how to live now. There were two or three artists. One was Gianfranco Baruchello, we presented a very large-scale work from his archive from Agricola Cornelia, which is the farm he had pioneered outside Rome. We basically exhibited a large-scale, in collaboration with a farm, a large-scale presentation of his drawings, his writings, his friendships, his produce, because Agricola Cornelia was based, as I assume you might know or might not know, on his work basically being the production of the farm. And he wrote a very important book called How to Imagine. So essentially this project allowed us as an entry point to start to think, okay, so having looked at all the failures, having looked at the city of Thessaloniki, having looked at its history and researched into that, how can we imagine another way? So here we have some works by Baruchello that were presented in the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki. And here are some of his sketches, which we presented, which formed part of this archive. Another artist that we looked to was Piero Gilardi, also an artist who very closely linked his practice to the streets and working and creating works for demonstrations. And here we have a mask of his that we had on display in relation to a work by Coyote in the background. So we had Gianfranco Baruchello and Piero Gilardi. And then we also another artist that we looked to as a reference point was Ahmed Morsi, an Egyptian artist based in New York, whose paintings have a sort of timeless, almost surrealist quality, where this work is called Blackbird 2, and where humans and animals and birds seem to coexist together on an equal footing. Placed it in the Byzantine Museum, which was a very difficult task, but we managed to persuade them. And in a room with all the icons, Byzantine icons, which for me was important because Ahmed Morsi also in his work, if you see both the bird and the humanoid creatures, they have these all-seeing eyes, which you can see echo the eyes of the Byzantine icons, but also because Byzantine icons rejected the idea of perspective and were meant to be a form of of sort of introspection. So one would look at a Byzantine icon and be returned to oneself rather than imagining a realistic depiction. And I feel like in Ahmed Morsi's work, a similar trope is used whereby space becomes a sort of a more ambiguous element. And then now turning even more to think about the future, having looked at these references and how to imagine and Piero Gilardi and Ahmed Morsi, we started to have some works which were more hands-on, thinking about truly ways of living now. One of these works was by the collective Vessel, who are based in Aegina, consisted of James Bridle and Naveen Gidosos, who created a work called Super Kiosk. Now, what's interesting about Super Kiosk is it's based in a building called the Islahane, which was the former poorhouse and orphanage in the late Ottoman period in Thessaloniki, which at the period, in the late Ottoman period, had a very inclusive policy whereby not only Muslim boys were trained in skills in order to find new jobs, but also Armenian, Jewish, and Orthodox boys were trained. And so what we did, what Vessel proposed in Thessaloniki, is they created another school. So for 10 days, students from the Architecture University of Thessaloniki were invited. There are about 12 of them who worked together with Naveen and James, and together using only recyclable materials found from various sources around Thessaloniki, they together designed a super kiosk, which was a form of participatory design. And together they created a water filter, a photovoltaic panel that could heat the tea. They had teas that they had collected from herbs and from the mountainous area of Epiros. So afterwards, once it was installed and after the workshop was completed, basically visitors to the exhibition could come and heat their own tea. The water was collected from the rainwater of Thessaloniki, was purified. All that system within this one building that you can see straight in front of you at the moment. So all of that system was basically a super kiosk where you could come, sit, refresh yourself, and be completely sustainable in the process and learn about this process of DIY autonomous living, which James and Naveen propose as a solution, not so dissimilar to Agricola Corlelia, but a way of basically providing for your own needs autonomously as a solution to the climate crisis. Here are some of the mugs that they had that one could drink tea with, the herbs, the kettle. Here we are at Ashley Chavusoglu's work, which also works well with Naveen and James' work, because again, it's about thinking about alternative economies and different ways of creating systems of food production. So Ashley collaborated with various farming initiatives in Turkey, whereby female collectives create a sort of safe spaces where they produce an alternative economy of agriculture, where they make their own produce, where they have work together. And each of these textiles correlates to one of the collectives or farming groups, female farming groups that she worked with, which inspired either a form of print or a form of embroidery. And altogether, they kind of form this vision of another way of working with the land, another way of regrouping and working together, another way of producing, basically. And here's a detail from one of the textiles. So as you can see, slowly from looking at the history of Thessaloniki and its fragmented past and questioning the possibilities of being as communion, we've moved on into thinking of the now, of the future, and how we can, if there are possible, and looking to roots and learning from different skills, techniques, collectives, and thinking of ways of working together. Within that, a very important element is care, and thinking of both also love, care, tenderness. And there's a quote by Bell Hooks, which sums that up, which is, all the great movements for social justice in our society have emphasized the love ethic. And coming to thinking about the love ethic, we come to this work, a really beautiful work by Hira Nabi, a 4-channel video called How to Love a Tree, where essentially she invited 4 different musicians to improvise and perform to dying trees in a forest in Pakistan, where the forest in Pakistan embodies all the different historical contradictions and malaise that the forest has gone through, from colonial exploitation to now touristic exploitation to the climate crisis, etc., etc. So in a sense, this is a form of palliative care, a form of giving back to these trees, to this forest, but also a question is, how do you love a tree? Is it possible to love a tree? Which raises all the ethical questions about what is a tree, what kind of entity is a tree, what is our relationship to other species, to the more than human? Can we ultimately love a tree? And so on and so forth. And thinking about care, there was another very important project in the exhibition for us, which is by a work by Greek artists called People Descended from Trees and Deer. And it's an artist who I invited specifically, a printmaker who's based in the peripheral city of Patras, which is a university city also. And I invited him specifically to work with another pioneer like Baruchello and Piero Gilardi and Ahmed Morsi, a female printmaker pioneer called Vaso Katraki, who importantly was very aligned with left-wing movements in Greece, and during the dictatorship had been placed in exile on the island of Makronissos, and so had been very much identified in the narrative of Greek art to be a very politicized Greek artist, but interestingly also came from an area of Greece called Etolikos, which is what we call the Venice of Greece, because it's a huge lake, very low standing, probably one of the first landscapes that will vanish as waters rise. And her work was very much born from her relationship to the land. And so Yannis Papadopoulos was invited to work with her as a younger generation printmaker and to work with her work. And in the beginning, when I invited him, he immediately said, I'm not interested to produce something new. How can I produce something new? All I want to do is to support her work and to make Vaso Katraki's work be reread in a contemporary context and reread outside the paradigm where she's been placed, so specifically within a sort of political activistic language, which is limited. I want to reinterpret and allow for a more broader discussion about the evaluation of her work. So he created this installation over a long period of discussions with Vaso Katraki's daughter. So the important thing is he no longer is working in this project as an artist, but both as scenographer, as a producer of meanings for her work. So he found, as you'll see here, this curtain which Vaso Katraki had designed for a hotel in the 1970s, and it's a fisherman. And he reprinted it with once the daughter of Vaso Katraki had accepted. And he then took the slabs that are her prints. She decided not to show any of her actual works, but just to show all the process behind the work. So you have here the prints, which he's placed mirrors, which also like the reflection of the lake in which she worked. There are photographs of her working and drawing on the lake. So he created a sort of a landscape which allows us to reappraise, re-see, rethink her work, and essentially be the support system for a pioneering artist of another generation. So I would say a very generous work, another work which, similar to Hiranabi, is a form of care, a form of sort of tenderness and care, and thinking of interrelationships and kind of taking a step back as a producer and more creating a support system for another artist. I'm not sure whether I'm running out of time. Hold on. So here is another, I'll show you two more works and then we'll close. And then you can ask me whatever questions you have. Again, thinking about this idea of support systems in archaeology and sort of a relationship between different forms of archaeologies. Here's a work by Jumana Mana, which she has presented many times before, but I think it has particular interest in the Thessaloniki Biennial because the ceramic shards that she created are placed in a room with archaeological finds. So suddenly these ceramic small objects take on another form of prominence and create another dialogue with what it means to be detritus, what it means to be a leftover, how we think about the passage of time, how we collect memories, things, objects, and how we constitute an identity, and how we create different forms also of coexistence between past and present, and fragments. Here's another close-up of a work. And then I'll go straight to here. This is a work which maybe I should have shown earlier in the presentation. It's by Abraham Agobase, a Nigerian artist, who this work is called Metallurgic Practice. And essentially, he looks at the mining in Nigeria. So this becomes, again, part of the problematic that works such as Naveen's and James' Vessel, or Hiranabi, or Yannis Papadopoulos try to answer in the work. I mean, how to love a tree, how to love this landscape, how to stop thinking about it as a form of extraction and as a form of just economic dependency, but in other terms. And then actually going back to that, there is a work by a Greek collective that's based, a couple that's based in Thessaloniki, who I think this is also an answer to all the works preceding this one. And so a work where in the this is a couple that lived together for 50 years producing small scale events and happenings. And one of their happenings was to create a flyer in the 1980s, which showed the two of them. And it says, "We love each other." And this idea of the ability to love, to care, to think, to be generous is something that was a recurring element of the biennial, as a response to the fractured past. And finally, this was a performance that was planned in the beginning of the biennial, but happened in the end at its closure. There's a performance by Panos Klavenitis, called a Greek artist, and the work is called On Becoming Animal, The Head. And he had created this bacchanalian event and coming together of all these disparate groups who work with transformation or work with dressing up or carnival traditions from different villages around the north of Greece. So he has both an anthropological approach, looking and collecting and finding out about all these different communities that work together, that work and celebrate together, if you like, and transform. And this idea of, going back to Hiranabi, how to love a tree, how does one become an animal? How does one become human? How does one swap? How does one think about this interspecies, interrelation? How does one rethink our limitations? So in this performance, basically 60 people from different collectives, from artists, contemporary artists who use transformation as part of their practice, to traditional carnival, whereas all came together in Thessaloniki and created this mad parade, singing, dancing with drums. And there was a moment of euphoria of this idea of this potential of transformation, of shifting paradigms, of, creating small fractures, which allow for a small element of hope or light in this particularly dark period that we're living. And I think that's where I would close. I think I've spoken for about 40 minutes. So
yeah, thank you.
How about you?
Thank you, Maria-Thalia. It was great to hear you talk about it and to understand all the complexities that you built on by reflecting on Thessaloniki's past and so on. I just want to give a reminder to the other people in the room. If you have a question, just raise your hand with the function, raise hand function, or just write it. If you have a question that you want me to read, just write it in the chat, and we'll take care of that. I'm really grateful to have heard the presentation and seen some of the works which feel very much in unison with the city somehow, with its history. I'll give the word to Theo Maria Coppola, who's following us here in the Zoom. If you want to speak.
Yes, sure.
Free.
Hello.
Thank you very much thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to be here, and thank you for this very generous and in-depth presentation of the project for this edition of the Biennial. I was curious about the reactions from the local communities and interactions with people in direct relation to this edition, how people would react, would they comment on specific projects, especially maybe as for works in public space. And yeah, that's a very open question, as a matter of fact, but that's what I'd like to know more about, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much, Theo Maria. So Thessaloniki is an interesting city. It has, in the last years, gone through a very conservative turn, an increasingly conservative turn. This is, in other words, it's going through a pretty dark moment, I would say, as a city, which is a real shame. It's part of the leadership of the city due to the mayor, due to many, many reasons that have come together. In planning the exhibition, I was very much aware of this, and I was aware that, you know, any small shift, even if small, would be something welcome, and therefore I'll say two or three things. One thing that interested me a lot was because the title of the exhibition was learned from this Orthodox philosopher. There were all sorts of Orthodox religious groups who shared it, which made me chuckle quite a lot. But I felt like this was wonderful. The thought that any priest might come along and see the works filled me with joy. As funny as that sounds, but we're talking about a very specific city here. Another thing that really interested me was the architecture university working with James and Naveen on Vessel. For them, it was a huge opportunity for the students, and they really owned the work. In other words, they took care of it. And one of the things that I didn't mention was that because it was so loved in the building itself, the Islahane asked to keep it for one more year. So it stayed in the space. And often, in fact, because I wasn't in Thessaloniki the whole time, when there were journalists or TV channels who wanted to cover the Vessel, it was the students who went and spoke on behalf of everybody. So in other words, they very much represented the work themselves. There were several works that were chosen specifically to touch and to be able to communicate with. But I found that the works that used mediums, for example, Ashley Chafusoglu, her work with the embroidery, was something that was very accessible. And I'm saying that it's an easy, a non-complex work, but I'm saying that in the population of Thessaloniki, because they understood that skill set, it meant that it had something that they could enter and understand. Also, we had a very close collaboration with the department, because with the Department of Jewish History in Thessaloniki. There's a wonderful professor who helped us a great deal, and he brought a lot of his students. And so there were lots of different groups, mainly I would say students and academics. I mean, Thessaloniki is a center for both Jewish studies and also Balkan history. So there were a lot of students of Balkan history who also came. And it was a specific choice to work with artists from the broader periphery. So that resonated, I think. Now, as to Panos Klavenitis' performance, I think everybody was baffled, but that's okay. Yeah, I don't know if I answered you.
Probably also the point of something such
yes,
so carnivalesque and so on. No?
Yes.
I want to follow up a little bit on this first question, which I thought was great because it covered in good parts some of the things that I wrote down as interesting points to talk about. But I wanted to follow up. You mentioned that you reached out to Department of Jewish Studies. You mentioned the Balkan history or the Balkan Studies class and so on. But as you mentioned, a number of communities that played a vital role in the history of Thessaloniki. I also wanted to very briefly ask if you at all found a way of reaching out to members of the communities that are still living in Thessaloniki that might have been interested and affected by this work.
Well, I'll tell you, one in working on the project with Coyote, one of the interesting things was that the Ladino language is spoken by a very small community of people, and they've set up a new school in the university where some people can go and learn the language if they want. And so we collaborated with them very closely on the translations, of course. So that was one way of being touched. And also with the Ottoman Turkish, I have to say, we also had a similar. So that was one of the works which in another way touched on different people. Most of the Ladino community, of course, people speaking that are of are older age. But this was the way that we brought them in a way into the broader sort of mapping of the exhibition.
One other thing that I think emerges very strongly from the presentation and just by looking at the artist lists and so on, is that the selection of the artist also follows a project of kind of reenacting and reinviting some of the communities which were living in Thessaloniki, which form kind of like the backbone of Thessaloniki's history. Can you give us a sense of how you went about this selection? Like, how did you decide to target specific artists from specific areas?
Well, exactly because in my first encounters with Thessaloniki, I realized that there was this luggage, this baggage, if you like, and this this history which hadn't been dealt with, and when this idea that if you do not treat your wounds adequately, and if you don't find ways of being discursive, of thinking about about your past in a constructive way in order to live in the future, I felt like it was important to touch, to invite, to think about all of this, and to have artists who in different ways represented these gaping holes, frankly, in the city, which is sorely needed. I mean, the city really needs to be able to sort of mend, if you like. I mean, it's not the only place in the world that needs to mend, but it did feel important to try and represent all these stories. And the interesting thing was that I didn't go to Thessaloniki thinking that that's where the project would lead me, but the city itself, after a while, it was impossible. I mean, for example, Coyote, the reason that project arose was because simply on the train going to Thessaloniki, they asked me, about what the Jewish community used to speak, and the answer Ladino led to all sorts of other things. So whether you liked it or not, in a city like Thessaloniki, with 3,000 years of history, it's almost impossible to avoid. But also, it's an interesting point for us to remember when thinking about how we can move forward, is that it's impossible to move forward without thinking about other forms of historical justice.
I want to go back to something that you've touched upon many times and throughout also this Q&A, but the presentation in particular, which is this continuous shift that you attempted in the exhibition between past, present, future, and so on. And because you mentioned right now that it was impossible to avoid it while being in Thessaloniki, I wanted to ask something that goes a bit more also in the definition of the spaces that you chose within the city itself, because you discussed that you used the public space, but you also used a number of historical venues, and you discussed the fortress, the Yeni Jami, and so on. And I'm wondering if you can give a sense for those of us that don't know the city as well, or that maybe have never been there, how much this plays a role in the contemporary cityscape, like how much this history is also very much present. I know the city well enough to
Well,
understand.
I think there are many readings of the city. For example, on one level, it's impossible to miss all these monuments. We were very, very lucky, and from the beginning, from the very beginning, when I was invited, I said I'm only interested to come to Thessaloniki and work on this if I can enter all these buildings, because that is what Thessaloniki's wealth is. And they really are significant buildings with lots of interesting, both architectural and historical and sort of social, many social layers. And so for me, that was one of the key aims. Now, also after a while, I started to think about this idea of scale and how I think as a biennial in a city like Thessaloniki, there was no need to make anything bigger. What I wanted was someone to be able to come within one day, walk from one space to the other, understand the multiple layers of the city, but at the same time enjoy the biennial and see that in dialogue. I felt like that was what I had envisioned, and I think to a degree it worked. And I think through the different buildings, from the two national museums, the archaeological, the Byzantine, to the Museum of Contemporary Art, MoMA's, to the Slechane, which was this Ottoman poorhouse, an orphanage, to the Yenizami, to the Megara, which is this contemporary building designed by a Japanese architect, to the glass pavilion. Really, you scanned and understood all these different moments. Also, you realize that the city is a city which is a poor city, which even if it has all this historical wealth, cannot in some way keep it updated and cannot make the most of it. So the idea was really to try and exactly create a narrative which worked on both levels, both on a city level and on an exhibition level, and to make it the right scale for that city.
Quick follow-up on this, because you mentioned it when discussing the works that you placed in the, I think in the Byzantine Museum, that it didn't come without complications, let's say. And I think all of us that have worked in cultural institutions that are less used to working with contemporary arts have a feeling of some of the complications, but I wanted to understand to what extent there was a dialogue with these institutions, to what extent these works were just placed or rather accepted and embraced by the institution itself.
It was a process. I mean, the interesting thing in the Thessaloniki Byzantine Museum is that it had to go through the Central Archaeological Authority of Greece and be accepted. So we had to make a very, very, very precise, when I say precise, centimeter by centimeter presentation. The good thing about that is once it had been accepted, even though there were some works which, there was one work specifically by Angelos Plesas, which because the museum is full of Byzantine icons, there are some people who visit it and still believe that it is a site for religiosity and for prayer. So some people were incredibly shocked, and we had quite a lot of complaints about his work, even though it really wasn't in any way threatening or offensive. I mean, I wouldn't have placed anything which I knew would be offensive. But because it had passed by the Central Archaeological Authority, there was nothing they could do. So in some way, even though it was difficult up front, it meant that the works were safeguarded in the end. And each space really had its own complications. And I would say that one of the larger elements of the project was persuading these different agents to get on board.
Maybe I can ask you one last question as we're running close to our end of time, which moves away a bit from these overarching themes and goes into one specific aspect that you mentioned, especially at the end of your presentation, which I found quite fascinating, and I'm always very interested also just on a personal level, which is this intergenerational dialogue that you build between the works of, you mentioned Rochello, Girardi, Basso, Catracchi.
Catracchi, yes.
And I was wondering as I understood it, there was a creation, at least for certain in Vasos's case, in Vaso Katratikis' case, with a contemporary artist. I think in the other cases, it was a more loose dialogue with other artists. But I'm wondering, as you were taking these as kind of references or major starting point from a discussion for the future, let's say, how and if you manage at all this discovery, for example, of younger artists, of these artists, or the guidance, for example, with Vaso and Panos?
Yanis Papadopoulos.
Sorry. So if you guided at all this process, or if it was a much looser way of interacting and just yeah.
Well, in Yanis's case, I specifically invited him to work with the work of Vaso Katraki. And from then on, I left him free. I introduced him to Vaso Katraki, and basically for them, it was a development, a very, very beautiful development of a trust and bond, because she had to entrust her mother's work into his hands, and to a degree, trust that he was going to honor it in the way that she would feel happy with. And I have to say that was achieved. Totally, I mean, she was thrilled by the presentation. And together, something very, very enriching, and a new bond and relationship was formed, which I think is one of the beautiful things that came out of the Biennial. Now, about the looser connections, there are some threads that again appeared, which I couldn't really represent in this presentation. But for example, Piero Gilardi and his costumes that he would create for the demonstrations against different politics, whether it's environmental or anti-fascist or etc., had recurrences. For example, Panos Klavenitis' performance is a contemporary take on this idea of carnival and dressing up. And one of the things that he talked a lot about was about how in the past few years, the carnival has been hijacked by right-wing policies. I mean, if you look at Trump and Capitol Hill, for example, and he was saying, how can we reuse these tools of masquerade for something which is politically more aligned to progressive causes? In parallel, there was a film by Skyhome Pinker that we were screened, Dislocation Blues, which is about Standing Rock. So again, about another form of collectivity coming together to demonstrate. So this idea of demonstrations and standing up, whether it's through masquerade or through taking on different roles, appeared in different threads. Now also Agricola Cornelia, also how to imagine, and the idea of farming and produce, again appeared in many different ways. So the threads were there, maybe some cases more clearly, some less, but I think if you saw the exhibition, you could see that there was a specific reason why these, let's say, artists who worked as pioneers in previous decades were chosen. It wasn't at all arbitrary. It was very much in dialogue with the younger generation works. I don't know if that answers you.
Yeah, I mean, in part, definitely yes. One maybe aspect that I can go back to and maybe ask you to specify a bit more, just purely personal interest here. In the process of being in dialogue with artists that were creating new work for the exhibition,
yeah,
did these reference, like, did you bring up this reference? Were they kind of in the discussion and so on, or was it more? I understand at a conceptual level for you to design an exhibition that has these references, of course. I'm just wondering if it also played a role in the active dialogue that you had with the artists that you mentioned.
Not so much. Pretty much all the artists that were commissioned to produce new works were usually in relationship to research based in the city, I would say. So they didn't look to, apart from Yanis Papadopoulos, they didn't look to other correlations with other artists. Initially, I just trusted the artists and the invitation to follow what they felt. I mean, what one usually does is, you know, give a broad source and then follow their interests.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, there was no wrong answer in that sense. I just wanted to understand.
No. But there isn't a wrong answer anyway.
What the process was behind, no? What kind of, yeah.
To be honest, with some of the works as well, the historical works, we didn't know until quite a few months later exactly which works would be loaned to us. So we couldn't really depend on that anyway, because it was something that came in slowly and changed and adapted as the exhibition planning progressed and as the spaces and the confirmation of the spaces progressed, you know. So it happened kind of organically, if you like.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'm extremely happy for the presentation and for the dialogue afterwards. I think it was hopefully very enriching also for those watching. And with this, I also want to remind everyone that the video of this will be edited and uploaded to our YouTube channel and our websites in the next week or so. For those that want to go back to it and re-experience and re-listen to everything that we said today. And yeah, I want to really thank you for your time, for the presentation, for having the strength to do it at this heat right now in Athens. And thank you very much, Maria-Thalia. Thank you very much for everyone that followed us today. And I also want to remind, of course, everyone to keep following our website and social media channels for future events of IBA. We have a more private event next week for IBA members, which is specifically aimed at the draft of a code of conduct that we're working on for biennials globally. So we, of course, welcome all of you there. And for the rest, yeah, we wish you a wonderful continuation of the day, and good luck for your next projects, both in Athens and in the next Biennials.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you.
Very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.